Let's go back in time to 1932 as Converse brings you historic footage of the legendary original Celtics, with whom all great professional teams are compared.
We have now taken over your radio.
Richie Guerin is about to show you the most important step in getting past a man. It's the first one.
And Oscar will inbound it. The men in green, the Milwaukee Bucks. That's Al Cinders against Bellamy.
It has Jordan. Allen shakes free. Gets two!
Gilmore on it.
Stop! Oh!
Brother. Lead Toledo artists. You get 21.
4:28 to go in the first quarter for the Cow Palace. Here's Barry.
Jordan. Open. Chicago with the lead.
All right, and welcome back to the Over and Back Classic NBA podcast. I'm your host, Jason Mann, and with me again is Jared Dubin, the editor emeritus of Hardwood Paroxysm and the host of Quo Vadimus on our HP network. Jared, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back once again. It's we're doing this back to back. It's very exciting.
Yeah, it is. So we today are going to talk about Tracy McGrady, who is 85th all-time in win shares, 86th in win shares per 48, 22nd in box score plus minus, 29th in value over replacement player. He is a two-time All-NBA first team, 3 times on the second team, twice on the third team. Had one top 10 season of win shares per 48, although 3 seasons in win shares in total. 6 times value over replacement player in the top 10 in the league. The Bill Simmons Pyramid has him 77th out of 98, and the Slam 500 has him as 97th. He was an incredibly elite player for 4 or 5 seasons, including one really transcendent year. Obviously didn't have the longevity of some of his peers, but certainly while he was a great player, he was quite amazing. So what do you think about Tracy McGrady's top 50 case?
Yeah, I think it's an outside case for sure. I think if you were doing something like a top 50 talents list, he would be significantly more likely to make it, because you saw how good at the peak of his powers he was. He was, right firmly in the mix of that like Kobe, Dwayne Wade conversation. But he was one of those guys whose the candle burned extremely brightly, but it didn't burn for very long. The first 3 years of his career when he was in Toronto, he didn't play that much. And the one season that he didn't have a lot of responsibility because he played on the same team with Vince and a couple other guys that were more established. Then his 4-season run in Orlando was just incredible, and the first few years in Houston were really good as well. And then very quickly his body started to deteriorate. Because of the knee injuries and the back injury. So it was sort of like he had this 7-season run where he was just, there was nothing like a T-Mac scoring binge. Very much like another guy who was, I would say my current favorite player is Russell Westbrook. My favorite player for a long time was T-Mac. They're both what I call binge scorers, where, all of a sudden they'll just go on a run where they put up like 14 or 15 consecutive points, or, 16 of their team's 20 points or something like that. They were both very similar in that way, but they would also go, long stretches of missing a bunch of jumpers in a row. And then all of a sudden it would just be like another scoring binge down the other team's throat. Mm-hmm. When T-Mac would do that, like the famous, 13 points in 31 seconds, it was just like you would be stunned the way it would happen. It's sort of incomprehensible, especially because of, he always got this rep where he was lazy because, the way he moved was so smooth that it didn't look like he was trying. You know, in that sense, not like Westbrook at all, who's like every movement looks like he's, you know, coming out of his body. I relate it sort of like to baseball with Robinson Cano, where, you know, when he was at his peak for the Yankees, everything looked like it came so easily for him. His swing was so smooth. His defense, it looked like he was gliding in the field. T-Mac was very much like that too, where it looked like he was sort of gliding up and down the court rather than running. So I think he sort of got, at times, a bit of an unfair rap for being lazy.
You know, the one negative for him is that not much success in the playoffs.
Yes.
I don't believe he ever got out of the first round, with the exception of when he was hanging on with the Spurs the year they went to the finals, and he was signed to the team at the end of the season and barely played.
And he had that quote, I think it was either his first or second year in Orlando, where they went up on the Pistons. They were one game away from going to the second round. And he was like, it feels great to go on to the second round. And then the Pistons came back and won the series.
Yeah, they were up 3-1, I think.
Yeah.
And it was the first year where it was 7 games in the first round. So if it had been the year before, they would have won the series.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know. Does that, do you put any weight on that at all? Or
somewhat. But I'm also a person who, players don't win games or series. Teams do. And I do think you can fault, you know, some of the times in Orlando they were better than the teams they lost. Like, I think they were better than that Detroit team that they lost to, and that's something I think you can fault a little bit. But when you're, you know, a lower seed in the Western Conference in, you know, the mid-2000s with all of those ridiculous teams, I'm not sure how much you can fault him for that, especially, you know, Yao was hurt all the time too, and then even in Orlando, Grant Hill was hurt all the time. These are teams that he was like superhumanly carrying to the heights they were at already. So it's difficult to you know, quote unquote, blame him for not getting further. I think in a way it's a lot like Carmelo, who was, you know, a guy that was dragging teams to lower half of the Western Conference seeds and then just getting beat by better teams. You know, it does knock him in terms of, you know, greatest players lists, I guess, but it doesn't diminish for me how good he was, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it is sort of like one of those things that kind of makes you wonder a little bit, because, I mean, he had those great seasons, and usually players that produce on the level that he produced are able to lead their teams further in the playoffs. And he had some good teams in there, although he had some really kind of stinky teams too that he kind of carried to, you know, 8th seeds along those lines. So it sort of limits him on the track record. But I think there's enough, you know, understandable reasons for why he didn't have more playoff success. That it's a slight negative.
It's not like he came into the playoffs and was just terrible.
Right.
I think with the exception of 1 year, he was uniformly like quite good still in the playoffs. Like I remember his first year in Orlando, that he was averaging something like 34, 35 points, 6 or 7 rebounds, 7 or 8 assists a game through, I think, what was a 3-1 loss in the first round of the playoff, if I'm remembering correctly.
0-1, he had 33.8 points, 8.3 assists, 6.5 rebounds, and it looks like that's the series you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, and he was just a guy that throughout both the regular season and the playoffs always had to carry such massive responsibility in his team's offenses. You know, routinely usage rates like in the 30 to 35 range, you know, scoring like, you know, again, 30-something points a game, and also carrying assist rates like in the 25 to 30 range. just looking at that 02-03 season, which I think was the year that they lost that 7-game series to
the Pistons. Yeah, I believe you're right.
the Pistons.
Yeah.
He had a 35 usage rate and a 30% assist percentage also. Mm-hmm. So that, like, right there, he's responsible for 65% of the Magic offense. I mean, that's just insanity. And you could tell just because of how much responsibility he had and how many minutes he was playing. A lot of times, like at the end of games and certainly at the end of seasons, he was a bit worn down. Mm-hmm. Which I think is part of what contributed to the, he's not a clutch player type of stuff.
Sure. Where he just
didn't always have it in him by the end of the year. Which, is certainly a thing that happened, but isn't necessarily the fairest thing to knock him for just because of how much he had to do. Mm-hmm. The one thing that I do think also played into that was where Jeff Van Gundy said, I don't remember the exact quote, but he said that Tracy was a guy that didn't tap into the full extent of his talent, didn't always, go necessarily as hard as like a guy like Kobe did, where there was so much there that you projected onto him that he didn't necessarily tap into. And I think that was particularly true for a few years stretch on defense. You look at a guy who's 6'9", moved like a point guard, and should have been able to be a guy like Scottie Pippen, where he was, just one of the best defensive players in the league at the same time that he was a great scorer and passer and things like that, and didn't necessarily do that simply because of how much he had to do on the other end. Like if it had worked out with him and Grant Hill, and he could have been like the Scottie Pippen to Grant Hill's, alpha dog Jordan on offense, he could have been like an all defensive type guy like Pippen was, I think. Mm-hmm. But it just wasn't in the cards.
Yeah. I was a little bit surprised is that he's actually, even though, he's sort of lacking longevity compared to some of his peers, he's 128th all time in minutes. Like he's ahead of like Bob Cousy, Kevin McHale, James Worthy, Dennis Rodman. I mean, guys who played for a long time. He's ahead of those guys. So I think he does have enough elite years, and he played long enough, and most of it as an effective player, that I think you can build a case here. I do think he is still kind of on the outside looking in, but I do think that there is maybe a stronger case than you might think before examining it.
I think if you were just taking guys' peaks, I think he'd have a better shot. Mm-hmm. But you don't just have a peak in the NBA. Like you have a full career, and he didn't play much at the start, which, right away put him sort of behind the eight ball in terms of compiling like all-time totals. And then towards the end of his career, when he should have been sort of a guy who was, still contributing at not necessarily as high of a level as he did before, but someone who maybe like, I'm trying to think of an analogy. Maybe, we talked about Gary Payton, like he contributed, still contributed at a decently high level to a championship team in Miami. I think he was like 37 at that point. T-Mac never had that because injuries sort of just robbed him of that whole stretch of his career as he moved into his mid to late 30s. By the time he was 31 or 32, he just couldn't play anymore.
Yeah.
And if he had like a second act of his career, I guess, like Vince Carter is still doing, the second act of his career as, a pretty high caliber role player for good playoff teams. that's something that I think would elevate people's opinion of T-Mac. And certainly he had the skill set where he should have been able to do that. I think you saw that for part of a season in Detroit where he played sort of like point forward almost. He tried to do it the next year in Atlanta, didn't work out all that well. But he could have been a guy that did something like that for, 4 or 5 years just based on the skill set that he had. But, because of his knees and his back, he couldn't do it.
Yeah. So if you were going to pick between Vince Carter or McGrady, let's say they were in your for number 50, who would you put first? Would you put Carter first or would you put McGrady first?
Yeah, I think you'd have to go with Vince. Not just because of the longevity, although that certainly factors in. I think T-Mac's peak was probably a little bit higher, just like the 2 years that he was, using like 35% of possessions and still assisting on like 30% of baskets, and was, one of those years I think he shot like 39% from three. Mm-hmm. But T-Mac's peak was higher. Vince's peak was longer, and he also had, the second act of his career as a high caliber role player. Again, that's still going on. Vince also is the best in-game dunker of all time. Which, is just sort of like a feather in his hat. It's not something that is determinative, but he also had that going for him.
Yeah, I'd argue for Dominique, by the way, but we'll let you.
Yeah, Dominique, certainly. I mean, Vince, oh my God.
Yeah, they're both in the conversation.
Yeah, you're hard-pressed to pick between the two.
Yeah.
I do want to get a T-Mac story out there, though.
Sure.
Because I have one of those also. In 2010, when he was traded to the Knicks midway through the season, right at the deadline, the first game that he played with the Knicks was against the Thunder. I coincidentally happened to have tickets to that game in advance. And he came in, and it was like the vintage T-Mac show.
Yeah.
He was hitting pull-up jumpers. He finished the game with something like 26, 5, and 5 or something like that. Like, it was basically like exactly what you would think of as a peak T-Mac game. He was hitting jumpers all over the place, getting to the rim. It was like this crazy close back-and-forth game, went to overtime. Durant hit a bank three to send the game into overtime, and then he hit another three to win the game at the buzzer in overtime. But, T-Mac was just like, for one night, it was like watching him exactly like he was before. For a guy that was my favorite player for a long time, to see him on my favorite team, to do that in Madison Square Garden, after he had basically not played for like 2 months because, him and the Rockets were having sort of a standoff, he just came out, and it was like, bang, he was right back to his old self. And it was one of the craziest things that I've ever seen live at a basketball game. It was really cool.
Yeah, I remember that. I watched that game on TV, or at least some of that game on TV. I remember the crowd going crazy and just the atmosphere.
Oh, yeah. Everybody was
really
chanting,
exciting.
T-Mac.
Yeah.
I had these two kids behind me that were sitting there with their dad that literally every time he touched the ball, for some reason, they thought he was going to hear them and respond. And they would just be like, T-Mac! T-Mac! I was in law school at the time, and me and my roommate were the ones that were at the game together, and still we will talk about those. It's 5+ years later now. We will still talk about how annoying those two kids sitting behind us were during that game.
Nice.
It was, oh my God, it was unbearable.
He had like a half like that for the Hawks in the 2012 playoffs against the Celtics.
Yep. I remember I wrote about that for the first NBA blog that I started back in the day.
Yeah, I mean, he had like 12 points, 9 rebounds. Like, all of it was like in the first half. Like, he clearly had nothing left. He played 40 minutes in that game for whatever reason. But, for a quarter for that half, I remember him, like, it was like, oh, yeah, this is, what he was, or a facsimile of what he was. And it was kind of neat to see. There weren't really that many good Hawks memories for T-Mac other than that, but that was nice.
Oh yeah, it was. Oh man, it was incredible.
So Jerry, anything else before we go?
Yeah, you know what? That the dunk contest that he did too. Or no, he didn't do the one that Vince was in. He did, I think, the one the year after, maybe. Because he didn't want to go against Vince.
Oh, okay.
Or maybe he did go against Vince.
I don't remember. I wasn't really paying attention around that time.
He either did the one against Vince or sat it out and did the one the year after. But he was also like Vince's passer for that crazy dunk contest. Like, he was the one that held the ball up for one of the dunks and bounced it for one of the other dunks. So he had like that cool moment that he was a part of also.
Yeah. He was in the 2000 dunk contest. That's the one. That's the famous one, right? McGrady was.
He was in that one?
He was in that one.
I'm trying to remember.
It appears.
Yeah, he was in that.
Okay.
Yes, because that was his last year with Toronto.
Right.
And they were in it together.
Yeah.
It was the two of them, Steve Francis.
Wasn't Jason Richardson in that, or was he not yet?
Jay Rich and Desmond Mason.
Oh, yeah. That's the... Yeah.
That was a great dunk contest. My God. Yeah, that was incredible.
Yeah. All right, Jared. Well, thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate it very much. Some good memories and good stories. You always have a good story about a player, so we'll count on you for that. And
that's what happens when you're pushing 30.
Yeah, there you go. So thanks everyone for checking us out. We're continuing to do these shows looking at the top 50 players, looking at the candidates, and eventually deciding on our own over and back top 50. So we appreciate everyone checking us out. And so until next time, thanks very much.